Welcome everyone to Empowering Young People in Self-Advocacy. We're very excited for you to be here and excited for our two panelists that are with us today. My name is Lindsay Garcia. I'm the Executive Director of the 22Q Family Foundation. I also have a child who is 8, about to turn 9 with 22Q. So this is a topic that I'm already starting to think about with an 8-year-old and really thinking about that transition from advocating for him his whole life, whether it's in the school setting, the medical setting, or really just in everyday world interactions, and how to make that transition from myself doing it for him to him becoming a self-advocate and the best self-advocate that he can be. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters and then we'll get started. So today's presenters, we have Ari Rabkin. He's a PhD pediatric neuropsychologist at Nationwide Children's Hospital. He specializes in working with children with craniofacial genetic conditions and cardiac disorders. And then we also have Jason Osborne. He's a volunteer career coach for the 22Q Family Foundation, leveraging his background in human resources and formal education, which includes a master's degree in HR and a professional human resources certification. We're very excited to have both of them. And we're going to go ahead and let Ari kind of go over some of the housekeeping slides first, and then we'll let Jason take it away.
All right. So for those of you joining us live, obviously we're doing this via Zoom. We are recording today's session. We do ask that folks put all questions in the chat function. We anticipate having a lot of people today, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. Hopefully the folks out there have done a number of these Zoom sessions at various times, and so you're familiar with the controls, but please do try to remember to mute your line. You do not have to turn your video on unless you want to. Just a couple of general reminders. Obviously, you can find the chat button either at the top of the screen or the bottom of the screen, depending on how your computer is set up. You can send messages to the entire group or as privately to one of the presenters. We do ask that you try to keep your audio muted so that we don't hear other folks talking. And again, you don't need to turn on your video as we do this, as we may not be able to see you as well. And again, these are just general reminders that if you see that red line, that means you're muted or your video is off. No red line, we can see and possibly hear you. All right. As we said, today we're going to be talking about empowering self-advocacy in teens and youth with 22q. We're obviously presenting today for parents of children and teens with 22q11 deletion syndrome. Neither myself nor Jason have any relationships with commercial firms, and the 22q Foundation does collect and utilize some administrative data for their programs as part of this. And I will hand this over to Jason, or I'm sorry, our objectives again is to kind of talk about working with adults in self-advocacy, talk about self-advocacy in youth with 22q, review some specific strategies, as well as talk about using SMART goals to help build those self-advocacy skills. And now I'll turn it over to Jason to talk more about his perspective as a career coach.
All right, great. Thanks, Ari, and thanks, Lindsay, for inviting us to have this conversation. I think the resources that are available through the 22Q Family Foundation are incredible. I just wanted to share a little bit of my background, both in the community and also and what we've done with our career coaching. So 5 years ago, we started a partnership. After my family and I, we started a foundation after we had a little girl born with 22q. She had truncus arteriosus. I think many on the call have dealt with different health issues, challenges, but also the blessings that come from really supporting someone who needs that help at times. And so we experienced that for a few months. Unfortunately, our little girl Shanna was only with us for about 3 months. She had complications from her heart surgery and eventually passed away. But what we really wanted to do is to give back to the community. And the skill set that I have, trying to leverage my background in human resources to help adults really be ready for the career world, as well as those who are looking for a career change, have support within the 22q community. And this is both those who are family members and those who have 22q. So it's been very rewarding. We've had great success, but I wanted to share some of the learnings that we've had in this endeavor that we've had for the last 5 years. Can move on to the next slide there. So the first thing that I would share with those who are adults, young adults, as well as parents, is recognizing that there is a strategy around communicating with employers. Many times I meet with adults that say, you've come from a background of going through IEPs, partnering with teachers, partnering with schools. How does this work when you're in outside of school? You're now in the workforce. How do I communicate with my employer? The first thing to know is that timing is very important in this. I will say that many times people want to overshare the things that may come up with either their son, daughter, or themselves. Many times what I'm helping them understand is that you will be able to share with your employer what accommodations may or may not be needed, but that will be after you've received an offer. They should really be assessing you based on your qualifications to do the job. And then there will come a time to discuss the accommodations needed in the job. Honestly, if you start too early, you don't really know what the job expectations are. So you might be oversharing information that may not be an issue later on. I like to think of the interactive process with employers like a tennis match. So you're volleying back and forth. So first of all, you would share maybe extra training time that's needed. Then the employer would say, how much time do you need? Well, I need an extra hour per week. Okay, let's see how that works out. I think many times we overthink the needs that we may have. It's important to remember that there are many in the workforce that have requests for accommodation, not just those with disabilities. And I think what's really happening from a business perspective is employers are realizing that it makes business sense to employ those of all abilities. So we are in a different environment than we've been in years past. Employers are legally obligated to participate in an interactive process. The reason I think it ties back to the timing being very important is because you may self-select yourself out by oversharing too early, because they are only obligated to participate in the interactive process after you've received that offer and are employed. So let's make sure that we're going based on the qualifications. And then, great resources available through the 22Q Family Foundation and our career coaching to help you navigate that. I think the other thing is preparation for conversations with employers is important. Many times parents ask if they can participate in this. Yes, it would be, if you think of the journey that many of you have had with your son or daughter, for those of you who are parents, you've always been involved, and it doesn't mean that would change. Many of the things that Ari is going to share later will help bring that self-advocacy, but it is important to learn that skill. So, that would be led by the employee, meaning that conversation with the employer. It is important to know who you're talking to. Many times someone that is employed, they look at their supervisor as their employer. Many times immediate supervisors do not make these type of accommodation decisions. It's a human resources team. It's a high level manager or director. So what I would say is it's really important to understand who you're asking for the accommodation from, and making sure that that's at the right level. All right, we can go to the next slide here. The other thing that I really like to emphasize with those in our community is that every experience is a skill that can be built and really shared with a potential employer. I think sometimes we think of the information we put on our resume as a specific employer. I worked for X company, for 6 years. I don't have that. I've spoken with many who have said, I don't have a job. I've never had a job. And so they kind of use that. It's kind of a block at times of like, well, I don't know what to include on a resume if I've never had a job. Many of those in our community have gone to different camps. They've participated in volunteer experience. They've been on project teams in school. All of these events and experiences lead to skills that, as a career coach, I help bring those out. I think one of the key challenges that not just our community faces, but everyone, is we have a challenge sharing our experiences and sharing it in a way that the employer would see that it's transferable to what they're looking for. So I think it's, what I would recommend is start early, start writing those skills. And remember, every experience is a skill. Have your son or daughter, or if you are yourself, building these resumes and speaking to employers, start in middle school, high school. It's never too early to start with experiences. Any volunteer opportunity is an opportunity to build those skills and make sure to write it down. I think, one of the things that I found as well is speaking to someone outside of the family member. And I think many would say this: a parent can say something to a child and it comes across one way. A person outside of the family, maybe outside of the parents, can say the exact same thing, and somehow it means a much more, or it's very different. And many parents I talk to are like, I've been saying that for so long, and it doesn't seem to be connecting the dots. But having someone outside of that parent-child relationship is really, really important to reinforce some of the things that are being talked about within the family in regards to career building and career pathing. So the last thing is, remember that everyone's path will be different. There are many who pursue a four-year college education and do great in that. There are also many who go to a technical school. There are many who go right into the workforce or go to an internship or volunteer experience. It's important to remember that every journey, every path is going to be different, and it is okay. And sometimes that's important for family members to remember based on our community here. All right, so I'll turn the time over to Ari to talk through some more self-advocacy.
Thanks, Jason. So as Jason mentioned, or as we talked a little before, I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist. And as a little bit of context and background, one of the things I always talk to families about is that my role is often about doing evaluations. We talk about testing, looking at different skills and abilities to kind of identify what children's strengths and weaknesses are. And I actually, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, I sometimes try to stay away from the term weaknesses and instead talk about areas for growth. And because of that, I often think about, with teens and young adults that I see as they transition to sort of the adult world, living off on their own or perhaps living nearby, really becoming their own self-advocate, and sort of how do they successfully make that transition to being an independent adult. And so one of the definitions that I really like about what does self-advocacy means kind of falls under sort of three areas. One is speaking up for themselves, taking charge of their medical care, and then making more decisions about their daily life. And this is really kind of a definition that I really like. It's coming from Disability Rights Ohio. And they have a Rise Up guide specifically for teens and young adults with different kinds of disabilities or other differing abilities to kind of help them build these sort of self-advocacy and independence skills. So I just wanted to also link to their website. It isn't just for people in Ohio. There are a few things that talk about specific resources, supports, scholarships, things like that are specific to Ohio, but there's a lot of really good general information as well. And so that's a really good option if you're looking for some really specific ideas. So taking kind of these three definitions about thinking about speaking up for themselves, taking charge of medical care, and making more decisions about their life, I want to really talk about how, as parents and adults, we can help our teens or young adults kind of make that transition and build those self-advocacy skills. And so one of the things that Jason talked a little bit about is practice. And as we sort of sometimes say, practice makes perfect, or practice, practice, practice. I think this is where it's even as parents of younger children or younger teens or preteens, we can start having them take on some of these responsibilities and roles. Just as an example, in most states in the United States, schools have to start a transition process for youth at age 14. Now, they can start that process earlier, but any child with an IEP, they're required to at least start considering, what does this transition look like at age 14? For some youth, that might be transitioning and planning to go to college. That might be vocational career training, as Jason mentioned earlier. That might be graduating from high school and getting a job. But again, there should be some type of transition discussion starting at age 14. I will also say sometimes in younger kids, it's more about doing perhaps a career interest survey or meeting with a guidance counselor to research different careers. So it's not necessarily something kind of a specific additional support, but it's really just thinking about that. And so I then think about that as, okay, if the school is starting that transition process at age 14, that may be a really good time for parents to start thinking about that transition process too. And that way you're kind of going along in parallel with the school as they think about, what's the process. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't start younger years and have kids start taking on some of these responsibilities. But if you're looking for kind of a specific time or age to start with, 14 is not a bad time to do that, since schools should likely be doing this as part of a child's IEP. And so then when I think about building self-advocacy skills, I really think about setting goals. And you may have heard this acronym before, but using the SMART way of setting goals, which is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And I have a couple of examples of this later on about some specific ways that you might use these SMART goals to create some self-advocacy goals, skills, and build those over time. So one thing I think it's important for us as parents and adults to think about, or even for the adults with 22q that might be listening, is recognizing our strengths and that's what I sometimes call areas for growth rather than weaknesses. And so if I think about some of the more common things that I see in children, teens, and adults with 22q, one, I can see a lot of anxiety, particularly in social situations. And so one thing that I talk to parents about, as well as to teens, is when I have a teen that says, I don't know, is it because they really don't know the answer? Or is it more of a, I don't want to answer, or having to answer this question in front of the class, in front of people, in front of my parents makes me feel really uncomfortable? And so one way to overcome that perhaps might be to better communicate through written ways, emails, text, things of that nature. Now, I'm sure Jason would tell you, though, to keep in mind that when we communicate through emails or text or other things like that, we still need to be professional if we're in a professional work setting. But that may be a better way of communicating information. Another example that I often think about, particularly in kids, teens, and adults with 22q, is that they may struggle more with visual information, or they might be easily overwhelmed if we throw too much information at them at one time. And so one way to sort of overcome this, or a way to kind of adapt to it, is use more visual and written examples. And a specific way that I often talk to parents about teaching kids and teens and young adults is using what's called forward or backward chaining. And I'll have an example of this on the next slide, because I find that that's an easier concept to explain when I have some pictures to go along with that. And as Jason was talking a little bit about earlier as well, it's important to be honest with outside agencies. So whether that might be a behavioral health provider, some kind of job agency, such as through your state or your county, your local boards of developmental disabilities, about what your teen or young adult can and can't do. Because I think sometimes as parents, we really want to emphasize the positives and all the things that our kids can do. And then we miss this idea that sometimes they require more practice to learn skills, or it took a lot longer for them to learn these basic skills. And so even though they're able to do something now on their own or independently, thinking back to when they first started learning about to do that skill, whatever it might be, it may have taken more practice or longer. And I think that really translates into a job setting, is that if we're learning some new job or work task, it's going to take more practice. It's going to take longer. And those are supports that you can get in a job setting, whether that's through ADA accommodations or work accommodations or other things like that. Another thing I think about is that if we're already using checklists, visual schedules, things of that nature to complete tasks, you can have those in a work or job setting. And those are all really appropriate accommodations for people in different kinds of job settings to learn new skills. So this is just sort of my example of a complex visual schedule. I took these screenshots from, there's an app out there called Magnus Cards, and you can download it from the Apple or Google Play Store. And it's really put together by an organization that's trying to build what are sometimes called visual schedules or social stories to help adults with different kinds of differing abilities. So that might be adults with autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, intellectual learning disabilities, or I'll include in there adults with 22q, learn how to do complex skills that we would expect as adults. And so this one in particular happens to be for washing clothes in a washer. And so you can kind of see how it uses a series of, in the Magnus Cards app, they call them cards or pictures to teach a skill of washing clothes. So it might be separating lights and darks, pre-treating stains, measuring out the laundry detergent, putting that laundry in the washer, and then turning the washer on. I mentioned on the previous slide a little bit about forward and backward chaining. And this is one way to teach our teens, or really even our children, different kinds of complex skills. And the basic idea behind forward and backwards chaining is you either start at the beginning or the end of a complex task, and you really focus on just one step at a time. So if I was doing this as a forward chaining process, I might start with just separating the lights and darks, and we're just going to practice that for a few weeks. And once my child or my teen has those skills, I might say, okay, this week we're going to separate the lights and darks, and we're going to practice finding those stains or pre-treating stains. Again, and just practice those two steps for a few weeks. And then once kids are able to do that, then we practice separating lights and darks, checking for stains, measuring out the laundry detergent. And you can kind of see how these skills build upon one another and to teach more complex skills. Backwards chaining is basically the exact same idea. We just go in the opposite direction. So we start with the last step in the process, which in this example happens to be turning on the washing machine and choosing the correct program. And so again, you'd practice just that for a few weeks, and then you would practice putting clothes in the washer and then setting the thing, and so on all the way back down. And so again, I talk about this and I'm using this when I'm thinking about teens or adults, but for the parents of younger children out there, this is also a way that you can teach a variety of different complex skills. The examples I more commonly use for younger children might be something like taking a bath, brushing our teeth, or getting ready for school. But for this presentation, I really wanted to focus on something that might be more appropriate for a teen or young adult in building independence. Other things that can be really important, like I said, is practicing speaking up for themselves. And so this is one of those challenges a lot of the parents out there is that we're used to talking for our kids, answering questions at the doctor, but that doesn't help them build the skills to be able to do that on their own or more independently. And so one tip that's really helpful for parents might be to sit behind your teenager at a doctor or another appointment. And so that really gets them to answer the questions from the doctor. And that way you're avoiding that tendency to jump in and answer for the teen. It also makes the teen kind of practice that, because if they actually have to answer the question or they need you to help them, they've got to physically turn around to look at you. And so again, it really gets the teen to start doing these things more independently and on their own. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to help our teen answer those questions and figure those things out, but we want them to really practice doing that and really practice before they turn 18. So in other words, we want the best for our teens and young adults, but we want them to start practicing these skills because eventually they might have to do it on their own. We might not be at those doctor's appointments or something like that. Now, that could just be because as you go into the adult world and you see, for example, an adult cardiologist or some other kinds of specialist, we wouldn't expect parents to typically be coming back to the exam room or meeting with the doctor. And this came up obviously during the COVID pandemic and when there were limits on visits to hospitals, if you're taking another adult to the hospital, they might not allow you to bring a second adult into the room. So it's really good to start improving and practicing these skills early on. Now, just to go back to the pandemic for a second, there are usually exceptions. And so this actually happened in my family. I had a family member who was older and had dementia. And there was a period of time when they had to go see the doctor during COVID when they were limiting or not allowing any visitors at all. And so they went up to the doctor's appointment on their own. And within 5 minutes, they had called his wife and said, "Hey, we need you to be up there because he can't answer our questions." Now, again, that was sort of at the end of life when we're talking more about dementia or the ability to answer questions more on your own. But likely those things can come up if there is another pandemic or another situation where they're just simply limiting the number of visitors. Another thing, and I kind of talked a little bit about this earlier, is taking charge of medical care. And this is, again, something you can start early and start with more simple tasks. So for example, if you happen to have a child, even a younger child who has a lot of medications they have to take, and they might use a pill box or you might use a pill box so that you don't forget to give them a specific medication, you can have them start practicing filling the pill box. Now with younger kids or younger preteens, you might start really simply, which is, I want you to put one of this blue pill in every single, spot. With older teens, you might say, okay, I want you to put one of your heart medicine in each box, and then I want you to put one of your anxiety medicine in each box. Or, you take your heart medicine in the morning and your anxiety medicine in the afternoon. So I want you to put your heart medicine in the AM box and your anxiety medicine in the PM box. And so again, you can see that we're starting very simply with very specific tasks. And even though this is not our intention, we're also starting to teach them more about which medication is for which reason. I also tell families that, it's okay to have visual or written cheat sheets that have lists of things like, here's my medications I'm on, here's the name of it, here's my dosage, here's which doctor prescribes it, or these are my diagnoses. These are important things for people to know, and the names of the doctors and what you see them for. And I tell families that you can really make these simple or complex. It really goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is kind of knowing strengths and weaknesses. And so if it is somebody who's really overwhelmed with a lot of, let's say, written information, keeping them simple, using pictures. In this day and age with smartphones and things like that, you can take a picture of one of their medications, put it out on a table, take a picture of, this is the blue pill and this is what it's called. In fact, take a picture of the pill next to the pill bottle and next to the name of the medication, which not only would show them which medication it is, but if you manage to angle your picture correctly, also shows the name of the medication and which doctor prescribes it. And that might be something simpler and easier to take from appointment to appointment than bringing the actual pill bottles or something like that. So again, these are things that we can do as parents and adults to kind of really help our teens or young adults as they transition to perhaps the adult medical care world and start taking charge of more of their medical care. So one thing that I'd like to do is I want to sort of speak to the parents out there or to the young adults or adults who are participating. What do you see as some necessary skills for success as an adult? And I know the presentation says put your answers in the chat. We're having a minor issue with the chat, so you can actually post your comments or questions in the Q&A section, and we'll look at some of the examples that come from parents out there. So again, what do you see as some necessary skills for success as an adult? And again, put your answers in the question and answer or Q&A section. And we'll give us maybe a minute here or so for folks to enter their answers.
None coming in yet. I was also told by one of the attendees that I think the chat might be working, so I'm not sure what's going on with our technology today, but okay, one just came. Oh, yep, now they're coming in. Can you see those on your end too, Ari?
Yes, I can see them. Yep. So Terry mentioned practicing and role-playing answers to questions and situations that might come up. That's a really good example that actually we're going to come back to a little bit later on. Dealing with difficult people. Yeah, that was one from Mariah, and that's a really good example of both in a work or in a home setting or in other kinds of settings. Other thoughts out there? And I'll give taking care of yourself. Yeah, so Pam mentioned taking care of yourself, and I would unpack that a little bit. That might mean something like staying healthy, going places, doing things. Rachel mentioned grocery shopping and cooking. That's a really good example that it's really important as adults that we know how to go grocery shopping, we know how to cook meals or things like that. Any other ideas about some other necessary skills for success as an adult?
I was going to say just trying to be as flexible as possible. I mean, I know things come up right now with my 8-year-old and I'm able to be there and kind of walk him through that. But, say I wasn't there and he's in his 20s or 30s and, there's a major news story that's on the air or something comes up in his life that, it's a little bit more of a struggle. I feel like that definitely takes some skills.
Yeah. Some of the other answers from the chat or the Q&A, living on your own and making those important decisions, transportation, managing emotions and facial expressions in a work setting, And particularly somebody talked about sort of being aware of time management and sensitivity to um, time. Yeah, and I think these are all really good examples of some of the things that we think about for success as an adult. And so some of these were ones that people mentioned, things just like daily kind of housekeeping, cleaning up, doing laundry, driving, accessing transportation, paying bills and budgeting, cooking meals, making and keeping medical appointments, and staying healthy. And that might be things like exercising, taking medication regularly. And so again, these are a lot of the things that often us as adults we do. And we don't always think about these things as sort of adult skills, but these are the kinds of things that, as I think about adults sort of being able to mention these kinds of things. A couple other examples that came in from the chat: stress management, which I would say is kind of part of that staying healthy, and learning not to tell people everything the first time you meet them. So that's a little bit about kind of understanding and knowing when and when not to share things. And that was something Jason kind of talked a little bit about early on. Some other things, and this is kind of some of the other things that people touched on, is kind of being realistic with yourself, thinking about your strengths and your areas for growth. And so one thing that comes up every so often for me is that somebody like a teen or an adult with really weak reading skills may really struggle to pass a written driving test. And so unfortunately for some folks, getting a driver's license may not be an option. Now, obviously that depends on the state and other kinds of supports and things like that, but that may not be the best option. And so instead of, say, getting a driver's license as a goal, you might want to think about an alternate goal, such as using public transportation or other ways just to get around. And so particularly for folks who live in areas where there's access to things like public transportation or Uber or Lyft, those can be really good options for those folks. Now, obviously, not everybody lives in areas where there is access to good public transportation, or there are frequently Ubers, Lyfts, bicycles, things like that. And so that tells families this is where you have to be creative. Ultimately, you're going to know what's in your area and what those different options are. And this is, I think, where really for me ties back into using SMART goals to try to set some of these goals in terms of building those skills, kind of empowering teens and young adults to do all of those different kinds of tasks we talked about on their own. And so when I think about setting goals, and somebody kind of mentioned this in the chat, one long-term goal that we might have is to live independently. Well, that's kind of a really vague, non-specific, hard to define goal. And so here's how you might really develop that independence through building smaller steps or goals that move towards that larger goal, and where you can use kind of SMART goals as an example. So for example, one SMART goal that might be going towards the long-term goal of living independently is, I'm going to use apartmentfinder.com to find 3 apartments that are 5 miles or less from my parents' house by December 1st. So again, we're really identifying something really specific. We're using apartment.com. We're going to identify 3 apartments. They're going to be 5 miles or less from my parents' house, and we've really set a date on it. So again, it's something really specific. It's measurable. We can almost like checking a box. Did we do this or not? It's achievable. I think that is something that's pretty realistic for most teens or young adults. It's relevant because it goes back to that original goal of living independently, and it's time bound. And so again, you can kind of see how we've taken something that was kind of vague and non-specific, like live independently, and really made it into a very specific goal. Now, for the teens or young adults that are participating out there today or watching this later on YouTube, they might say, oh no, I want a place that's more than 5 miles from my parents' apartment, or maybe it's 3 hours from my parents' apartment. That's a little bit of a different discussion. I won't go down that rabbit hole right now. But again, the idea here is we're just really using these SMART goals to set examples. Another one might be, I'm going to use Excel to keep track of all the money that I spend for 1 month. And so if you think about something about living independently, having a budget and keeping to it might be part of that. So again, this is sort of a specific goal that really helps move you towards living independence in terms of budgeting and finance. And now I put here Excel as an example. We could use, and I'll talk a little bit later on about maybe some apps or other ways that we can use things to help with these goals. You could use something more complicated like Mint, or there's a variety of other online resources that can help with things like budgeting and finances. But again, for these examples, I wanted to keep them at least a little bit simpler. So again, this is just one example of how you might use SMART goals to kind of build towards that larger goal of living independently. Another example might be learning to budget my money. And so here's where you might use a SMART goal to create smaller, more specific goals. And this is, again, something you can practice even with children or younger preteens or younger teens too. So I might create a shopping list with at least 5 items that total less than $20 and go to the supermarket twice with my mom before December 1st to buy those items. Okay. So again, you can see that we've used kind of the SMART goal to set something really small, specific, realistic, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Now, here's where I think we can also then think about and tie in some of those areas of strengths and weaknesses that we might see in a teen or young adult with 22Q. So if you're somebody who's pretty anxious in social situations and the idea of going into the supermarket and having to do all these things on your own causes a lot of anxiety or dread, maybe instead of creating a shopping list and going to the grocery store, I'm going to use the Kroger pickup app on my phone to do pickup for groceries. And again, same idea is that instead of creating a shopping list, I'm going to use the Kroger pickup app on my phone to buy at least 5 items for less than $20 before December 1st. So again, the basic idea here is you have the same general idea of grocery shopping, managing money, but you're really modifying it in a way that kind of understands those strengths and weaknesses and kind of, if we need to, there may be accommodation supports, not necessarily in a work or job setting, but outside of work that really can reduce some of those situations that might be really challenging. Now, one example I had a parent share with me recently is, well, I use the Kroger pickup app, but guess what? If I search for apples, there's a lot of different apples at the Kroger store. And that then might tie into another area of weakness, which is that tendency to be easily overwhelmed. And so it's a really good example of you're going to have to practice these things, really start doing them ahead of time. And you might need to even break that task of using the Kroger pickup app, even smaller tasks with more practice. And so again, this is just an example of a screenshot from, and this is the local Kroger near me, of when I just searched for apples on the app, here's how many different apples popped up. And I could have kept scrolling down and down and down, and there were many different kinds of apples here too. And just to share a small personal detail, me personally, I like Granny Smith apples, and that's not even one of the apples that showed up here. So I would have to scroll down pretty far to find those Granny Smith apples that I like to eat. Or obviously I could change it to search for Granny Smith apples. So again, just an example of how you can kind of use SMART goals to set a really specific goal around practicing shopping, budgeting, things like that, and make some modifications if you need to, knowing some of those strengths and weaknesses and things like that too. So that really kind of ends the formal presentation here. We really wanted to leave some time here at the end to answer questions or if other folks had other ideas or things that they wanted to know.
We did have one question that came in. It was a little bit more specific, but I think the general question is relatable to everyone. So when dealing with like a super tough kind of emotional situation, the question is, how can we reset in this situation when we self-advocate for ourselves and our disability, how to stay positive in a hard situation, which I think is a really great question.
Yeah, and this is where I often talk about using your resources, using your supports, identifying them. So one of the things that I didn't get into that comes out of that Disability Rights Ohio self-advocacy guide is identifying your people, the people that are there to support you. So for adults, it might be a parent, it might be a formal person like a behavioral health therapist or a job coach or something like that. But who are those people in your life that kind of help you when you get into those difficult situations? And who are the people there that are both supportive but also kind of being helpful too? So I do think that's one really important is knowing who your people are, identifying who your resources are. And it doesn't always have to be a specific person. So for example, it could be an online support group. It could be for parents. It might be a parent support group, something like that. But knowing who and again, I just keep coming back to saying the same thing, which is knowing who your people are, the people that you can go to. And I think recognizing too that giving yourself the grace that we're all people. We all have those moments that we get overwhelmed or too many things are happening, and we might need to take a break from things and step back. And that's also where you can kind of know who those people are that you can go to support you when you are feeling distressed. And again, that might be a formal support like a counselor or a therapist. It could be a parent, it could be a close friend, or it could also be a community that you're involved in. And again, it could be whether it's through your faith community, it could be an online support group, or kind of other things like that.
Great.
I was just going to share a thought that I had around, one of the trends that I've seen when it comes to Adults, especially those who enter the workforce in our community, is um, sometimes they will have an event that leads to them feeling they need to end it all, like meaning end employment. Like, I have had a really difficult interaction with so and so, therefore, and sometimes they will literally make that decision on the spot. They will say, I am done with this job. All of it's done. I can't do it, so I'm just going to leave. And I try to make sure that I emphasize that as an employer, it's very difficult when someone walks off the job or abandons the job. And so really what I would recommend, from an employer perspective, as you're entering the workforce, is try to take a step back, and maybe for parents, give your children experiences that allow them to take a step back and reassess, really emphasizing that, because it will only become more impactful as they progress further. Because you could imagine, if you walk off the job, it's very difficult to then come back and say, I didn't really mean it, I was having a very difficult time. But it goes back to the communication with the employer. There are individuals that I've worked with that do not share anything with the employer. And especially in our community with the spectrum, it's very challenging if you don't share that with the employer, because they right or wrong, they put everyone in the same bucket as, well, you just decided to leave the job, or you didn't share with us what was going on. So I think these are really hard skills to build, but the more that they can build those in middle school and high school, like, okay, we're making a reaction right now, how do we take a step back? I think it becomes more glaring in the workforce.
And I think Terry commented in the chat, just like the sooner that we do these things and kind of help extend kind of the comfort zone of our children, the better, because they're just gonna have that much more practice, practicing and practicing, so that it isn't as uncomfortable of a situation, if they're able to kind of put some of that stuff into practice early on. We have another question from...
Actually, I'm going to interrupt because I want to go back to something Terry said. She kind of talked about really extending yourself and doing that in a way that is safe, And so I use the example of sort of going shopping and doing something. But here's another example that I've given actually to teens and parents of teens that I've worked with is I might say to them, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to hand your teen $40 before you walk into Kroger and say, here's all the money you need for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the next week. You go figure it out. Buy whatever you want, right? But it's got to last you the whole week. And if they go and just buy a whole bunch of chips, then that's what they're going to live on for the next week. Okay. Now, as parents, yes, can we give an Olympi a little bit here? But sometimes having that extension and what we sometimes call sort of natural consequences, or being able to extend yourself. And if you fail a little, do that in a really safe way. Now, again, obviously, if our teen goes and buys, like I said, a whole bunch of chips and that's all they buy for the week, okay, yes, we want them to do that. But the idea is, and I think this is to also kind of just extend what Terry was kind of saying, is start doing those things early, start doing them often, start practicing them when they're young. So sorry, I interrupted you, Lindsay. You were saying you had another question. Point. So,
and I think it's also just, it's extending them, but also extending ourselves as parents. I think a lot of our kids a lot of them are medically fragile as, babies. And so we've maybe almost lost them a couple times and tend to kind of cater to them a little bit more than maybe our neurotypical kids. So that to me is even like harder sometimes for the parents, because we're really having to kind of jump out of our comfort zone. And when you're talking about the chip example, it's like, oh, that just makes me cringe, that they're not going to get the best nutrition possible because maybe they're underweight or whatever. But I think it's a really important comment and point.
Yeah. The next... and by the way, a nutritionist might disagree with me there for a second, but when I say this, I'm not meaning for like the next month. Like I said, do it for a week or do it for a couple of days. It's kind of like I say to parents of younger children, if there's some toy that they keep not cleaning up, they might go to sleep and next day that toy's not there, and maybe it comes back a day or two later, but it's gone for a little bit. And that's what we call natural consequences. So I tell families you can practice those minor natural consequences when, let's say preteens or kids in a safe way with some limits to that. So sorry, I keep interrupting and talking.
No, you're not. It's great. It's all really important information. Okay, so we have Chandra that has two questions. One is trying to get our 20-year-old budget on a budget, but it's been unsuccessful so far. She saw the SMART plan that you outlined, but she's rather adverse to using an app. She makes her own money, but not living independently. What would you tell this mom?
Yeah, so that's a challenge because, to be honest, it's kind of the opposite of what I see for most teens and young adults this day, which is they want an app. They don't want to go old school and have, let's say, like a written planner or a written checklist or something like that. And so this is where you kind of have to think about, well, if they're really not interested in using an app or something like that, maybe we do go a little bit old school. We do use, let's say, a written list or something like that, or we start maybe with Excel, or even Excel is too complicated. We just start with there's a method of budgeting called oh, I'm going to get the name of it. It's called basically envelope budgeting. I'm getting the name of that incorrectly. But the basic idea is that we take literally physical cash, we put in a series of envelopes that we write on the outside, food, transportation, rent. And you would then use that money throughout the, let's say, the course of a week. And once that money's gone, you can't buy food anymore or something like that. So for somebody who's a little bit more risk averse to, let's say, using an app, or they're just not willing to do that, that's a very physical way of doing budgeting. Now, there are a bunch of different apps out there, and if you Google, and if I had the name of it correctly, again, I think it's called envelope budgeting. And again, I apologize, I can't remember the exact name of it what it's called. It's honestly, I think it's something from, like, it's not something new. This has been around for a very long time. What's new about it is now there are apps out there that will essentially let you do that with, credit card statements, bank statements, and you can link your credit card and bank and statements together, and it will do that automatically. But if I have somebody who's not willing to use an app to budget, again, maybe that is something where you do use something like using a physical envelope that you put cash in. And that's one way of sort of teaching that. So that might be a way to sort of focus on really specific budgeting and doing it in, like I said, a little bit of an old school way, not using an app. And then there was a second question.
Yeah,
I think
I did just Google that, by the way, and you were correct. It is called envelope budgeting.
There we go.
I think too,
Envelope
it's just
budgeting.
a nice visual. A lot of our kids are just so visual. So, yeah. Did you want to answer that second question from Chandra as well?
Well, I was gonna say I'm gonna actually let Jason answer this one. But
yes, that's what I meant,
Jason,
yeah.
if you can't see the chat, Chandra was saying, my daughter did what Jason did, which is jumped into a new job and realized after that the original one wasn't so bad, and she went to her first employer and asked her job back. So the question was, she hadn't shared that her learning disability diagnosis with, it sounds like, the first employer. Did she need to share more? Is that something that she could have done earlier?
Yeah, so what I would say in that case is, I noticed that you said she hasn't shared her diagnosis with them, but did share she has a learning disability. What I would recommend is that less is more in this situation, meaning we have many in our community know 22Q like the back of our hand, and we know all the variables. We know all of the challenges that our children face with this, and that can sometimes lead us down the road of putting our child in a corner as well. So here's what I would say: share what accommodation requests are needed. So I wouldn't even start it off with, I have a learning disability. I would start it off with, I need extra time on X, Y, and Z, or I need, be very specific. And what's challenging about this when you're on the job is we have to get used to looking at what the task is. So realizing that when I open, I feel like there's a lot of stress to be open by 6 a.m. So I don't feel like there's enough time. Instead of being on the opening shift, can I be on the afternoon shift? I'm definitely willing. I still want to work all of those things. Then you could say the reason that I need this is I do have a challenge with high stress environment. I can do the job just fine. I just need a little bit less stress put on me for the time frame. So I think it's very important to share with the employer. Remember, the thing that I shared is you have to speak to the right person. So I wouldn't have them go to their supervisor necessarily. They would go to their supervisor and say, if I have a request for an accommodation, who would I talk to? Some smaller companies do not have HR or human resources, but they would have a manager or a leader. You want to put it in the ball in the court of someone who is a decision maker. And a supervisor, the challenge with an immediate supervisor is they're probably not well trained in how to deal with it. And unfortunately, they may actually cause a retaliation against yourself for sharing that, and we don't want that either. And it can be, not. It can be like, well, all of a sudden the performance started going downhill after they shared that they have a request for accommodation. So we just have to navigate that the right way. But it is important to share specific requests. Being specific is important because then the employer can make that decision. And I will say that most employers are not able to prove that it's an unreasonable accommodation. Most of the accommodations that are requested for those with disabilities are reasonable, and it's very difficult to prove that it's unreasonable. But we do have to be specific, and I will say that many of those in our community want to tough it out. They want to say, you know what, I don't want to be different. I don't want to be treated differently. I don't want to. The challenge is if you don't communicate, it will get to the point where they may think that you're not performing, or they may think you don't care. And sharing the background of why is really important. So I know that was a long answer to your question, but I think it is important to share as long as it's a specific request and it has to do with the work setting.
And I'll just add something to that to kind of generalize that slightly, or in a different type of situation for college students or people who are in some kind of vocational training program. Typically, you want to share that information. There's usually a Office of Disability Services, Office of Student Support Services, something like that at most colleges and universities. And so that's really the person that you want to go to if you need something like testing supports or extra time to take tests in the college or university setting, not the actual instructor or the professor. Now, you might need to meet with them depending on what the Office of Student Services or Student Disabilities would do, but really you want to get registered and have the Office of Student Services, Student Disability, everything, every university, college calls it something slightly different, but you want to register with them because they're the ones who are ultimately making the decision makers, and they might have a lot of supports. So there might be a testing center that students go to when they need supports on tests. And so then they would notify the professor, the teacher, the instructor that, hey, this child, this teen, young adult, I should say, this, Mr. Jones in your, Psychology 101 class needs to take their test at the testing center. So you have to send those tests to us 2 or 3 days in advance or something like that, which is exactly what happened to me when I was teaching at actually community colleges. I had several students who were registered with the local, the Office of Student Disability Services. And so I knew, hey, I need to have my test sent to the testing center 2 or 3 days in advance. And then they have this time frame. They have 1 week from the day of the exam to take the test. Again, there were some limits and outlines for that too.
They're both great points. We have another question. I have an 18-year-old with 22Q that struggles getting up in the morning and getting ready in a timely manner, even though she wants to go to school, go to activities, et cetera. Any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a really good one, a really challenge one for parents of a lot of teens in general, not just necessarily teens with 22Q. I actually kind of liked one of our other participants actually jumped in and started asking and making a suggestion, which was, does the teen have a good sleep schedule? Do they take naps during the day? And so what Terry was kind of getting at is that what is their, we call it sleep hygiene. And so that can always be a tricky one, is that particularly with teens, they want to take that nap after school or something like that. And really what that does is it makes it difficult to fall asleep at night. So here's the one I often say to teens when they're sitting in my office, and I say this to them in front of their parents, and I always get that death stare, that burst into flames look from teenagers when I say this, when I talk about sleep hygiene and things like avoiding tablets, phones, TV, things like that within 2 hours, 1 hour, 30 minutes of bedtime, avoiding those naps, going to bed, sleeping at the same time on the weekends. And that way you keep that regular sleep schedule. So yeah, Terry, that's a really good idea. That's really one good thing to think about, is what does their sleep schedule or sleep hygiene look like? The other thing, getting back to Jackie's kind of original question, is, and this is where I think you can kind of talk to a teen, have that conversation more like an adult, which is, your goals are, you want to be able to go to these after school activities, or you want to be able to go to school and you want to do well in school. And we sometimes call this values-based intervention, which is the basic idea is that it's really important to you, or school is really important to you, and you really want to do that. And at the same time, you struggle sometimes to get up in the morning. What's that about? And here's where, like we said before, avoid that temptation to jump in and answer for your teen. Because what you're doing there is you're sort of identifying to them, hey, school is really important to you. This is something that you want to do. You want to go to this, or you want to go to that early soccer game on Saturday. And it's really hard for you to wake up in the morning. What can you do? So in other words, you're kind of putting that back on the teenager to start thinking themselves through, okay, what could I do differently? Okay. And so that's really, again, you're identifying that there is this mismatch between the value of wanting to go to school and their actual day-to-day behavior. So that's something that might be really helpful, particularly for an older teen, is to get them to start thinking of those as well. Jason shared just a program for those of you who can't see it, which he's had a number of young adults get into. It's called the REACH program through the College of Charleston, and it really helps in that home to college transition. And there's actually a number of universities and colleges out there that I would say have similar programs for teens and young adults. There is one in Ohio, and I don't know what's going on with me this morning. My brain is just not working. I think I want to say Muhlenberg College that also has kind of a similar program out there, really to kind of help young adults make that transition to college.
And as a foundation too, that's kind of one of our more short-term goals, is to provide a list on our website of colleges around the country that really help with that transition and kind of cater more to our community. Addison had a comment I just want to share. I know everyone can see it, but for the people that are viewing this on the recording, I'm a child development major. One of my classes required recorded tests every few weeks. Another suggestion is if it's harder for screen recorded tests, the teacher may let you take the test in their office. It sounds like Addison's already doing a wonderful job at advocating for herself, and I'm glad that you shared that comment.
And that's, I think, something that's, I would guess it's probably new in the last couple of years because of online learning. I suspect prior to COVID pandemic shutdowns, it would just simply, you're taking the class in the lecture hall with everybody else. And that goes back to just an example I was saying before, which is when I think a lot of the teens with IEPs who get things like extra time to take tests or taking them in a smaller setting, you can have those same types of accommodations both in college, but also potentially in a work setting. Because here's the other one where I get death stares sometimes from teenagers, which is the tests never go away. Even when you graduate and become an adult, and I'm sure that Lindsay and Jason have their own experiences, and I certainly have this experience, you still have to take tests as an adult. It might be something really important like a professional licensing exam, or it might simply just be if you're working in a job where every year you have to do some kind of updated education about, maybe it's around safety in the workplace, or particularly in different types of HR settings. I'm sure, Jason, that every year the people that work with you have to do some update on, disclosure of people stealing or something like that. And I work in a hospital setting, and every year we have to do, more our yearly review of hand hygiene and learning about bloodborne pathogens and things like that. So I'm just making the point that the tests never go away. And that's another thing that you can continue to get those types of supports in different settings. Addison added that she's actually an in-person student. She just hates recorded tests. And I'm going to be honest, I think I would really hate that too if somebody had to watch me on video as I took a test or something like that.
Same. It's crazy. Well, we are wrapping up our hour. If anyone has one final question, we can take that. I think it's been a really thorough discussion. I know I've learned a lot of just easy takeaways that I can easily implement even with my 8-year-old at this point. There is one more question. Don't know if this is related to what we're kind of discussing. So I think I'm not going to mention it at this point. Ari, did you want to wrap up with this final slide?
Yeah, so we also just wanted to include a couple other resources that are out there, including websites and books for parents. So obviously you can find more information about the 22Q Foundation as well as the Career Pathways program at the 22Q Foundation website. You can also learn a little bit more about the 22Q Center at Nationwide Children's Hospital where I work. I mentioned the self-advocacy resources from Disability Rights Ohio. And then again, the Magnus Card apps that I took those screenshots from, you can find that in the Apple Google Play Store. And then just a couple of books that I like for parents, particularly for parents of older kids: Life Skills Activities for Secondary Students, Not What I Expected, and then obviously information that's more specific to children with 22Q Foundation. The third edition by Donna Cutler Landsman of her fantastic book came out I think a year or two ago. I forget. It was sometime during the pandemic, and if you're like a lot of people, that time kind of all merged together. And then my two favorite books for kind of young teens and young adults, particularly who struggle with executive functioning skills, is The Smart But Scattered Guide to Success. And then they have a newer book, that same author. It's called The Smart But Scattered and Stalled. So those are by Peg Dawson and Richard Guar. And just to warn folks, there are several books in their series. There's some books they have that are more for teachers. There's some books that are kind of developed more for executive functioning coaches or ADHD coaches or therapists. And then there's also books for parents of younger kids. So that would be Smart But Scattered and then Smart But Scattered Teens. So if you do get their books in their series, just make sure you get the right one for your age. And then just a couple final thoughts. As we mentioned, this video presentation will be posted on YouTube. Obviously, it is November, so we encourage you to show up to support the 22Q Awareness Month and get involved in different activities that are in your area. And then last thing, particularly around educational services, we always like to remind folks about the Riley Dempster 22Q Family Foundation Scholarship that provides scholarships supports for parents to obtain educational advocacy services. And you can find more information on the 22Q Family website.